Well, welcome to today's webinar, China's World, What Does Xi Jinping Want for His Country? I'm Mike Wardle, I'm CEO here at ZN and your chair today. It's a great pleasure to chair my first webinar of the year, where it certainly won't be the last as we run through. Just a word to thank our sponsors. We are very lucky at the FS Club to have sponsors who enable us to hold these webinar series and to run quite freely over the areas of technology, economics, finance and science. And a real thank you to them for continuing to support the FS Club and its work. Just moving on to the programme for this morning, very simple. My job is to introduce and get out of the way pretty quickly, and then we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Professor Kerry Brown. Just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, the session is being recorded, so if you have to drop out, or if you have a colleague you think might be interested, there will be a recording available on our website within about 24 hours of this session. Secondly, we've got a Q&A session, as you'll see after Kerry's presentation. For those of you who've used GoToWebinar before, you'll know the drill. For those who haven't, you'll see that towards the bottom of your GoToWebinar dashboard, there's a question panel. You can open that up and type in questions, and I'll field those towards the end of the session. And please put your question in at any time during Kerry's presentation or during the Q&A. It's now my great pleasure, moving on, to introduce Professor Kerry Brown, Professor of China Studies and Director of the Lau China Institute, at King's College, London. We are extraordinarily lucky this morning to have Kerry's expertise, and it's really is a joy to welcome a real expert and to get his insights about where China is and where it might be going in terms of his thoughts today. Kerry, delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So if I could have the next slide, please. As Michael just said, introducing me, I'm at King's College London, and I'm looking at Chinese contemporary politics and its international relations. And of course, the two are intimately linked. What happens within China and how it relates to the world outside is, kind of almost two sides of the same coin. What I hope will become clear as I speak today is that we're in a very dynamic period where it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the next couple of days, let alone what's going to happen, kind of over the next year or two and further along. And so what I thought I would start by doing is saying, well, who are the key dramatis persona, basically, who are the key personnel that we should be interested in shaping and crafting China's domestic and international strategy. In October 2022, a few months ago, a new group of leaders emerged at what was called the 20th Party Congress at the very topmost kind of level. It's currently 7. Historically, it's been as low as 5, and it's sometimes gone up to 9 members. This is the standing committee of the Politburo. There's a full Politburo, which is about 24 members. Again, that historically shifts a bit from 25, 26 down to about 22, but it's now 24 members. And then we have right at the top this group of 7 people, 3 of whom were in the previous Politburo standing committee and 4 of whom are newcomers. You will notice immediately that there is a somewhat homogeneous look to them in terms of their gender, their approximate age, their dress sense, although of course that's neither here nor there. What is important is that this group of figures is clustered around the man whose photo is the largest, Xi Jinping, and he's been in his position since 2012. This group of people are really implementers of a long-term vision to make China great again. Has, as I say, been in place in one way or another for a long, long time. It's not something that they have created. And I think that's important to stress. These are not kind of innovators in a sense, they're implementers. They realize the vision of a great and powerful and strong country. I could, and I'd be happy later to say things about each of these members because they are worth looking at and understanding. They have significant powers and they influence and shape the world probably more than any other group of a similar size in the rest of the world. However, what I'm going to talk about today mostly is Xi Jinping himself and his vision, which is the vision in effect of the Communist Party of China for the country's future. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, at the heart of this vision is a kind of necessity for China to spell out its message to the world. Why would it need to do this? Well, in a very short period of time, basically 40 years, but really intensively over the last 20 years since China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, the Chinese economy has risen and risen to become now the second largest in the world. And although it's a controversial subject, it's possible it will be the largest sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. That means China cannot be shy and hesitant and not say anything about what its global vision is. But it does mean that the conspicuous difference between China and the outside world in terms of its political structure has become more and more evident. China remains a Communist Party-led organized entity, highly centralized in some ways, decentralized in others, but with one political party having a complete monopoly on organized political activity and therefore on power. And that's just not going to change if Xi Jinping and his colleagues stay in the position they're in. There's no negotiation about that. The Communist Party of China, therefore, is an unavoidable elephant in the room when we talk about China's vision, because it's hard to kind of spell out what's the difference between its vision as a national entity, a sovereign country, and the vision of the Communist Party with its 96, 97 million members, which is almost like a state within a state, but has no real alternative to what it offers. Xi Jinping is the successor to a guy called Hu Jintao. The previous president and party secretary was, in one respect, completely different to Xi. He was very silent. He didn't really say much about China's international vision. And that created a lot of unease and criticism by America and others because it was seen as being disingenuous and maybe kind of insincere. But now, under Xi Jinping, we have an alternative, which is a more vocal approach to global affairs and a vision in things like, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, which in one form or another has been in place since 2013. If there is a China narrative for its relations with the outside world, this would be the first place to start. And as you'll see, there is the Belt, which is the northern red part, going through Central Asia into Europe, a mixture of railways, roads, infrastructure to create trading relations with a disparate but important and emerging group of economies. And then you have the road, the maritime road, the blue part, complicated, an acknowledgement of China's huge reliance on seaways, sea routes and maritime trade, and the fact that it is still the world's most important manufacturer. And is not likely to change. And a lot of that is kind of really guided by its maritime routes and its logistic routes via seaways. The maritime aspect of China's power, however, is where things get tricky because, as you see, that blue route goes through much contested space in the South and East China Sea, where Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and others feel that they have claims on particular territories. But also that is a seaway which is predominantly a kind of influence and under some forms of security control by the United States and its important navy. And so this seaway, although it's an enormously important logistics kind of element for China, is also, in terms of security and politics, a place of argument, a place of, where you can see Chinese power and the power of others, particularly the United States, coming in sometimes into real conflict with each other. At the heart of that sits, of course, the issue of Taiwan and its contested status. And we can talk about that maybe a little bit later because it's a huge subject. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at the Belt and Road in practice, we have to remember that there's the perception of the Belt and Road, and there's been a lot about debt trap diplomacy and about China trying to exercise influence and, you know, kind of really use its economic muscle in order to get political and geopolitical gain. But then there is also the practicality of what's happening on the ground. Gwadar Port in Pakistan has been, for at least the last 10 years, one case study of Chinese investment, aid, foreign relations in practice. Pakistan's relations with China are incredibly important. I mean, they have a very narrow kind of border, but they are diplomatic allies for a long, long time. Of course, in having a relationship with Pakistan, China also has to balance that with its issue of its relationship with India, and also the kind of issue of how Pakistan involves important security issues. And of course, we know about those in the news recently with the kind of very difficult relationship with Afghanistan and Taliban across the border. I've just been to Pakistan actually last month for the first time. And so I kind of can speak about this maybe with a slight more amount of insight, because my impression was, we're talking to people in Karachi, which is about 150, 200 kilometers from this port, that despite all of the concern and rhetoric and, you know, kind of this claim that China has enormous interests in Pakistan, up to 45 billion US dollars of aid, actually, it's hard to see it on the ground. And that may be because of the impact of the pandemic. It may be because of other reasons, but you wouldn't go the part, at least I saw of Pakistan, and say, this is a place with a very heavy involvement by China. It's not that visible. Now, of course, I may not have noticed many things, but again, I heard that Gwadar Port is not really, you know, kind of the sort of model Chinese investment that people often talk about. It gives China options and logistic capacity and is with an important ally, but Pakistan is not an uncomplicated ally. And I think it is more of a kind of case study that raises the sorts of challenges and complexities that China faces as it tries to become a global actor. So I guess my initial conclusion really for this is, while China is a significant actor, in many ways, the more significant it gets, the more challenging it gets for China. This is not a kind of straightforward, victorious march to global dominance. Far from it. In many ways, China is feeling, you know, kind of crossing the river by feeling the stones, as it were. And I think we see this kind of tentativeness in a lot of its external investment and activity. Next slide, please. Of course, in Europe, we can look at much more kind of close to home examples, and Huawei has become really a kind of important case study. What's not to like about Huawei? It's a telecoms company, good technology, affordable, comprehensive. There are very few companies like it with the capacity it has. Huawei produces personal mobile phones, but also produces complete infrastructure for telecoms. And it produces pretty much everything that you would need if you wanted to run an information system. But there's one problem. Huawei is a Chinese company, and not just any old Chinese company. Huawei is the key telecoms company in China. So that's a combination of an extremely sensitive sector that involves complicated and often sophisticated security issues, issues around technology, and issues around how much a Chinese company that says it's private can be allowed to enter sensitive sectors in countries in Europe, North America, Australia, and elsewhere, which definitely don't share the political values of China. There's an enormous amount of literature going back a long, long way, at least until the mid-2000s, about Huawei. Indeed, the Sunday Times in 2009 carried a report claiming that Huawei was a threat to British infrastructure because of its relationship with British Telecom. I think about £1 billion of trade in that relationship, investment. However, Huawei, at least until relatively recently, continued to be involved in 5G and other projects in Britain and was regarded as a manageable security threat. Well, since the United States hardened its stance towards China under President Trump about 4 or 5 years ago, that's changed. Huawei has been told that it must exit the UK, at least critical infrastructure system, by the next 3 or 4 years, and maybe sooner. And its involvement in the UK has definitely been downsized. What was once regarded as a significant potential partner in Europe, for a combination of reasons, is now regarded as much more problematic. Some of those are about the security issues, some of them are about Britain's relationship with America and therefore needing to do things to comply with America's demands because of the importance of that relationship. Some of it is simply about the fact that Huawei now looks to other markets in Africa, Latin America, and domestically, where it's still highly profitable and successful, and really feels that with all of the impediments to its trade in Europe and America, that it has other places it can look. Huawei is really symptomatic of the challenges of contemporary China, way beyond this particular sector. It's symptomatic of the fact that China is now a technology innovator in some areas. It's putting huge amounts into research and development, and it is becoming a significant research partner. But it's also a testament to the fact that Chinese companies are no longer straightforward old state enterprises where you can see the hand of the state everywhere, but nor are they completely uncomplicated non-state actors. They exist, at least companies like Huawei, between these two. They are not state companies in as much as the state is not the kind of overt owner of them in the way that it is for PetroChina or other Chinese state energy companies. But nor can you really say that in a sector like this, Huawei would be able to operate without close supervision and involvement by the Chinese state. And indeed, the national security legislation makes it pretty clear in China from 2015 that you are obliged, wherever and whoever you are, if you're Chinese, to report or obey any edicts from the Chinese government that relate to national security, and that's very, very broad. So Huawei is a hugely important case study. Next slide, please. One of the issues I've already touched upon with Huawei and also with the Gwadar Port is China's relations with the United States. This is the key relationship. It's unavoidable. We are all, whether we are in the United States or China or elsewhere, involved in this relationship. It's important because of its scale. They are, by way and afar, the two largest trading partners with each other. It's important because of geopolitics. We are looking at the world's first and second largest economy, and if you put them together, they make something like 45–50% of the global economy. I mean, they're hugely significant. But in terms of the fact that they are both powers that have a significant view of their status as either superpowers or globally important powers that aren't like others. China, of course, doesn't regard itself as being a US number 2. It sees itself as being a China number 1. And that means that it has a very bespoke view of what its role in the world is. It doesn't want the responsibilities and security commitments that the United States has with its 600 plus military installations across something like 120 countries globally. China currently has one maritime installation in Djibouti in Eastern Africa. And although it's looked at other places, none of these have happened yet. But China definitely doesn't want that kind of security commitment. It doesn't want it because it's observed the enormous pressures and challenges that that has brought to America over the last 7 decades since the end of World War II. America's involvement, for instance, in the Middle East, in areas, in Latin America and elsewhere, where it has been drawn into complicated political issues, where it's had to, in a sense, take sides, is something that China definitely doesn't want to duplicate. The big question is, can it avoid that? The second big question is, how do these two manage a relationship where they are obviously politically so different and do not share each other's worldview or values? When we look at these two figures, President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, we can see two very different worldviews, and the G20, where this was taken in Indonesia late last year, was the first time since Biden's election when he physically met Xi Jinping again. He'd met him before as vice president and as a senator many times, or a number of times, but this was the first formal meeting in office. This relationship had been going through, as everyone knows, a really tough few years of increasing contention, trade fights, and then with the pandemic, real clashes over sharing of information and who, in the end, the pandemic could be blamed on. And Biden has continued the policy of Trump in being extremely aggressive and kind of assertive about what to do about China. The era of benign economic engagement to see political change come about is over. We are now in a period where there are no illusions. It's the golden era of hyper-realists. So despite this, at the G20, the two, I think, realize that they do have no choice but to try and work out some kind of consensual way of talking to each other, which isn't always about clashes. And they have to do that not just because if things get out of control, the consequences for them and everyone else are pretty dreadful. They have to do it for a couple of other reasons too. Firstly, because on really critical existential issues like global warming or control of pandemics, China and America have no choice but to work with each other if they want to try and solve these issues. And secondly, because despite all of the abrasiveness that they show towards each other, they rely on each other almost as much as they don't like each other. The problem is that they cannot decouple. You just have to look at trade figures, capital flows. I mean, all of these are things that have changed a bit, but they're still a kind of way of illustrating just how mutually integrated each of these powers are with each other and the global system. They cannot be easily picked apart. The United States-China relationship is the key relationship in the world at the moment and likely to stay so, but it is a kind of relationship which is almost unavoidable. It cannot be, there can't be an attempt to divorce each other, but it's also a relationship in which there's baked into it the source for perpetual tension. This relationship, therefore, we are looking at the goal of simply having status quo. That's all that we can manage, and perpetual management of the problems. I don't think there's going to be any big breakthrough anytime soon. Something dramatic would have to happen for these two to put their issues aside and have, a kind of happy, benign relationship. Next slide, please. Well, of course, beyond the United States, and this is where I'll kind of wrap up, there's China's relations with the rest of the world. It's very obvious why I would put Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin together. We can talk about Russia and Ukraine. This is something that's aroused a great deal of interest, and China's evolving position on the invasion of Ukraine by Russia last February has been, I think, very revealing. Not because it gives China a nice model for how it might manage its issues, for instance, with Taiwan. On the contrary, I think it's probably raised for China some really sharp and difficult questions about what its global role really is. A reason why I say this is because you'd assume that China's influence over Russia would be significant. They are powers that have a kind of alliance. They share a massive border, thousands of kilometers long. Historically, they've had a huge influence over each other. And under Xi Jinping, his relationship with Putin has been regarded as good. Despite this, what we've seen in the last year is a sense that these two are not natural allies, and that they're always going to be significant tensions under the surface. And the question is just how deep and kind of difficult those tensions could become. Xi Jinping, you could argue, had a unique moment of potential leverage over Russia during the invasion. It was possible that he could have used his unique influence over Russia to try and bring outcomes that would also get him kind of plaudits in the West. That hasn't happened yet. What we've seen is China really trying to sit on the wall to stand by its alliance with Russia, but also to admit and acknowledge that there are outcomes to this war that would not be good for China, particularly use of tactical nuclear weapons, which China has spoken strongly against, and that may well have influence in Moscow in ways that other speaking don't. We've also seen a kind of China that is not really the sort of pushy, assertive power that many claim. It has definitely reverted in some ways to type in trying to just sink into the background and not be noticed. And of course, it's impossible for it to do that, but that's, I think, what it has been trying to do. Recently, I suppose, like everyone else, it has been struck by the incompetence and poor performance of the Russian military and how tough this military operation has proved. It may be in the next few months that China does take a proactive mediating role. That isn't impossible. It's possible also that China would work much more in concert with others to bring about some sort of revolution to this tragic situation. But I think the least likely outcome is that China will simply take hold of it itself and try unilaterally and bring about a kind of accord. I just think if it could have done that, it would have started making those moves much, much earlier. It's also important to recognize now that, just as the final words I'll say, China's position as of today, which is why, to come back to the comment I made right at the beginning, we're in a very dynamic situation, is particularly influenced by two things. One is the precarious situation of its economy, and there, of course, there are many others in a similar situation, but its economy is clearly going through significant headwinds. Its property market is looking very vulnerable. Unemployment is rising, although it's hard to give a specific figure to it, but it's definitely going up. Its growth has been poor in the last few months. And coming to the second issue, its attempts to emerge from the pandemic have proved really, really difficult. Again, everyone else has been in a similar situation. China attempted to impose a zero COVID approach. That has now been jettisoned much more quickly than people expected, as a result possibly of protests late last year, but also just admission that this was economically disastrous. We see China at the moment, therefore, struggling with what seems like a really nasty spike. And this is something that other countries have experienced too. But with China, the scale is clearly much, much bigger. So China is now in a really tough position. That impacts the way it deals with the rest of the world. It's now being far more conciliatory towards the United States. It's making some more constructive moves over the Russia-Ukrainian war. It is being more careful in its diplomacy. The question is how long-term that is. This is an historic pattern. When China feels beset by internal problems, it tends, well, sometimes it is much more conciliatory with the outside world. At other times, it can become much more shrill and confrontational. So there's no hard rule, but I think what we're seeing at the moment is a China which is taking a more conciliatory approach because it's admitting that it's going through a tough time. I think that's the final slide. Is there any further slide? I don't think there is. No. Yeah, I mean, so this is just an acknowledgement that recently, to back up the point I've just made, China has been going through some pretty energetic kind of diplomacy. There's, you know, kind of few of the meetings it had, and I think the final one, the final slide, if I remember, if I could just have the final slide, please. Yeah, I mean, the recent visit that Xi Jinping made to the Middle East, in particular Saudi Arabia, it's kind of very striking that there are these new alliances emerging with a world away from the United States, even though, as I've said, the United States still remains very important. Thank you very much, and I return to Michael. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kerry. Fascinating oversight and a real tour de force in terms of keeping us up to date with current events. We've got quite a number of questions come in already, and please do keep questions coming if you want. First of all, from Clive Bullin, just asking a simple question, you know, what are the advantages of the UK building a closer relationship with China? And do you think that's important? Would you recommend us to do so?
Well, I think we have to admit, after the golden era 70 years ago, I mean, the attempt was made to create a new kind of, I suppose, upgraded relationship with China, and that's that didn't work. I mean, there's many reasons why it didn't work. They're not all the fault of Osborne and the people around him at the time, and the Conservative administration, the coalition administration, and they're not all the fault of China. I mean, the geopolitical grounds shifted. Trump happened, a more confrontational relationship with China, the pandemic. So we're in a different kind of period now. It's no longer useful to talk about the golden age. But I think the Prime Minister Sunak Mansion House speech a month or so ago really kind of heralded a return to pragmatism, and you know, and a necessity to kind of accept that there are areas where we are definitely able and can work with China, and there are areas where it's not going to be possible, and either that's because of our own security issues or because of our alliances, in particular with the United States. So as I said earlier, I think we're in a period of super realism, pragmatism. We have to be very clear about where we want to work with China and why we want to do it. But we also have to be very clear that there are areas where we do need to work with China. We can't just sort of blithely talk, as some politicians do, about, you know, this being a zero-sum thing where you can just tell them to go away, we don't want anything to do with you. That world is a fairy tale world. It doesn't exist. China is going to be part of our future. The question is to what extent and to, you know, in which areas and how, where we want to have control over those areas. Thanks.
Thanks so much. A couple of people, Drew Drury, Robert Rhodes, have mentioned the sidelining of Zhou Lijian, the wolf warrior mouthpiece. And so I ask the question, can we expect to see a more engaged and constructive foreign policy emerge under the new Foreign Minister, Ji Gang, or is it going to be more of the same?
Well, I think it's, I mean, Zhou Lijian's sort of moving to another position. I mean, he's still in a significant position dealing with quite sensitive issues. So in a sense, he could probably, you know, kind of be even more significant because he's gone back to being a policymaker rather than a spokesperson. So I don't read a huge amount into that. I mean, Qin Gang's appointment is more significant because, you know, firstly for the UK, Qin Gang did three tours here. And I remember him being here when I was at Chatham House in the late 2000s. I remember going to Wimbledon with him. If I remember rightly, he's a big tennis fan. I can't remember what match we saw, but I remember we went to Wimbledon together. And so in that sense, he's I don't say I'm an Anglophile, but he's very familiar with Britain, so that's good. Wang Yi, the previous foreign minister, was more of a Japanologist. So we've now got someone who knows a lot about Britain. That's a big advantage. The second thing is that Qinggang, in tone, is certainly more adept and more smooth and slick. I mean, he's not going to deploy crude nationalistic language. I'd be very surprised. He didn't in America in his brief period there. So if he didn't there, I imagine he won't when he's foreign minister. However, before we get too excited, he is, a deeply kind of embedded member of the Communist Party, a faithful, loyal warrior for the Communist Party. He's from a sort of elite, kind of background in a way. I believe his father or his parents were also important kind of Communist Party officials. So this is not a guy who's going to kind of break paradigms. But he's certainly a guy who has proved he's pragmatic, he's adept, he's a better communicator, and he's willing to communicate. And I think that's, in the current circumstances, not bad. I mean, it could have been far, far worse. So I think it does mean that we're going to have a different tone to foreign policy. And I think that's helpful because tone matters.
Thank you very much. We've got a number of questions coming in, so we're going to have to move quite swiftly. There's a group of related questions around the whole question of Taiwan, I guess. First question Peter Cousins has asked is, how important is that as a domestic issue in China? The second issue from Gary von Lehrman and others, do we think there's a realistic prospect of military action? Will China risk a war with the US? And relatedly, do we have any assessment of cybersecurity risks and cyber war technology as part of that potential conflict? So quite a large subject, I know.
Okay. So very quickly, I mean, firstly, domestically, of course, Taiwan is massively important to the great nationalistic rejuvenation narrative, which Xi Jinping referred to on the 16th of October at the Congress. It's one of the great strands of his policy. Nationalism, populism, Taiwan really sits at the heart of that, and the idea of reacquiring this. Well, so I've been corrected. Of course, historians can argue that you can't reacquire something that maybe you never had in a very uncomplicated way. But the idea of this sort of kind of reunification in the mainland's terms, this is a real domestic political issue, and people, whether they're fond of the Communist Party or not in China, I think, will probably sign up to this. It's an emotional issue. Likelihood of conflict, well, in a sense, it's out of China's hands. I don't think China wants to get into any sort of military, kind of options. But if its hand is forced, as it was when Pelosi, the previous Speaker of the House of Congress, I think it's the House of Representatives in America, when she went to Taiwan for a day in August, you immediately saw Chinese responses, a sort of 4 or 5 day blockade. Now, the two trigger moments, well, there's going to be 3 trigger moments in the next 2 years. First is if the newly appointed Speaker of the House of Representatives decides to duplicate Pelosi's visit this year or next. That's going to cause big ruptions. The second is elections in Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen comes to the end of her second term and therefore the end of her period in power in 2024. If she's replaced by someone with a much more pure and severe view of, kind of independence for Taiwan, we have a problem. The third is America and its elections, also around about the same time, at the end of 2024. If it's going to be someone with a very, kind of aggressive view on Taiwan, who might not want to observe the one China policy, well, then we really have a problem. Now, in the past, that wouldn't have been a very realistic thing to talk about because no American politician would really have questioned this policy. And as a sign of how strange the world is in which we live, Trump, although does he sort of have a good chance next time or not? Well, who knows? But I mean, he's more likely to stick with the current policy. I mean, his transactional politics. He's not one of the Republicans who will probably want to really question this. I mean, it's not of interest to him, but there are others who certainly would, who might stand as candidates. So if we have that situation of a new American president, a new Taiwanese president, basically asserting the end of the one China policy and more autonomy leading to almost kind of complete independence for Taiwan, then we really have the trigger. And there China's hands are tied. It will have to do something, and it will have to do something quite dramatic. So in a weird way, we always say about this area of foreign policy, China's the one with the agency. No, actually, in a strange way, China is passive here. It's what the world outside does that dictates this. If it doesn't do anything dramatic, the world outside, I think we just get status quo. And that's as good as we can live with for as long as we can live with it, hopefully perpetually. On cyber espionage, cyber security, I mean, I'm not an expert in this area. All I will say is that Taiwanese are extremely used to and aware of this issue. In Aubrey Tang, they have an incredible digital minister, and she has spoken on this issue many, many times. They are probably world leaders at dealing with the threat from China in this area, but it still remains a very significant threat. I think in the last few years, their issue has been disinformation, and also in attempts by China to influence Taiwanese elections. It has to be said that that has not been successful because the outcome of elections in the last few years has not been to China's favor. So we can take some comfort from that.
Thanks very much. We've got time only for a couple more questions. Donald McCrae asks whether Chinese leaders believe in the long-term survival of their form of communist government. Is it where they're going? And a related kind of question as to whether China takes sufficient advantage of the USA's political weaknesses. The system in America is weakening political structures, increasing political turmoil, and just some insights on the contrast between those two positions.
Yeah, I mean, on the first question, 100%. The Xi Jinping and his colleagues believe that their responsibility is to make one-party rule sustainable. They don't want to duplicate the USSR and fail after 70 plus years, 74 years. And I think this year they will overtake the USSR as the longest period in power in a significant, in a major country or a large country by a communist party. And so that's the historic mission, and they talk about that all the time. In terms of exploiting the weaknesses of others, well, up to a point, of course, it's useful for China that it's dealing with a weakened opposition in America and Europe, and it can take advantages from that. But I think in many ways in the last 10 years, it's probably been quite unsettled by how fast the decline of Western power has been. The great financial crisis in 2008 was really an historic watershed because I think it really made China realize that the West was not superior even in capitalism, So that has been a very significant watershed. We would not have Xi Jinping and the kind of leadership we had under him without that event. Because I think if it had been managed differently or it hadn't happened at all, then probably China would have been much more cautious. But the nationalism and populism and much more aggressive belief in China finding its own way and not duplicating failed models from the West has definitely been reinforced.
Fine. And very last, Douglas Andrews referred to the visits of Scholz, Macron, Michel to Beijing, and you talked about sort of the charm offensive, I guess, between China's put in place. But the question, I guess, is, is this a charm offensive by the EU, and how might that affect European business relations with China? And secondly, where does the UK fit into that if Europe is starting to make those overtures?
Well, those are the issues that we could spend the next hour or so talking about. Very briefly, I mean, I think the European Union struggles, obviously, to kind of create its own relationship with China because of the enormous influence of America. And whenever opportunities occur over the last 2 decades, from getting rid of the arms embargo, which was stopped by the United States in 2004, to kind of trying to have its own relationship in terms of trade and economics with China in 2018, 19, and then, really being given pressure by America to just toe the line. It's always quite frustrated. It's clear, certainly, that for key players like Germany and France, they really do need to balance their security issues with their significant trade issues with China. I mean, certainly Germany. So the tightrope walk, I think that's just going to be, that's always going to be there. And at the moment, in a sense, because of the pandemic, it looks quite dramatic, like these visits are really important. I think it's the same old, same old. They're just going to carry on trying to balance. To come to the UK's role, it is already clear that the opportunity that Brexit was meant to open up for a different sort of relationship with partners like China, which were not significant investors and huge partners in Britain, but could become so maybe as we revised our relationship with more traditional partners in Europe, that just hasn't happened. It is a big paradox that those who really supported global Britain, the idea of, well, once we're out of the EU, we can then become much more global, have also, well, some of them created a pretty tense relationship with China over things like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, kind of all sorts of issues. And so the kind of challenge for the UK is, as a global player, the world's second largest economy and a fifth of the global GDP is really, really important. Last year, our trading relationship with China met record levels. The deficit, though, did not change. It was still 2/3 of the trade was China's advantage, 1/3 to us. Our investment from China is no better in percentage terms than it was 150 years ago. It's still 2%, about 2% of our investment goes. So the question really is, if Britain wants to have an enhanced trading relationship and investment relationship with China, it can do that, but there are going to be huge political and security questions that it needs to get on top of. At the moment, we aren't doing that. So until we do that, I think we're just going to have this, relatively important relationship with China, but very difficult one, and kind of sort of stuck between two houses.
Kerry, thank you. We really are pushing up against the limits of our time available today. We'll have to bring you back at another time to continue the discussion. We'd be delighted to do so. So coming to an end, just bringing things to a close. First of all, again, a word to thank our sponsors and for allowing us to put on these series of events. We really are very grateful. Just moving on to looking at what's coming up in our programme, we have a session on the curious economics of authenticity on Thursday tomorrow. Next week, the surprising power of ideas that don't make sense, workers' voices, and the importance of relationship banking in the digital world. So plenty of meat to enjoy as we continue through January. And so finally, just to say that we've had a comment from Robert Rhodes just saying thank you for what a remarkable for such a remarkable presentation. I'd like to echo that. And so, as well as thanking the audience for your participation, my job is really to thank Professor Kerry Brown for his insights, for the clear exposition of his views on where China sits at present. Of course, if we were live, Kerry, we'd have a large round of applause at the moment from the audience. Instead, you have to make it with a very small round of applause from me. But really, many thanks. It was a splendid session. We look forward to seeing you all again, and goodbye.